So Parham and I met about 4 or 5 years ago at Berkeley for the IS4SI, which is an International Society for the Study of Information conference, which was at the Berkeley campus that Terry hosted a few years back. And since then, we've really established a collaboration as neuroscientists, and now we've brought that collaboration here into this sort of trying to bring neuroscientific and biological ideas to the scale of geography and the noosphere. And Parham, in addition to being a wonderful colleague, is also a wonderful friend. And I'll add one more thing that he was doing while he was setting up the conference. He was watching Captain Underpants with my kids because they really wanted to watch that with him. So they're back there. So
that's the inspiration for this talk.
That's the inspiration for this talk. That's right, exactly. So thank you, Parham. You could get started.
Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Yeah, I don't think the mic is on, so you'll just have to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it. So I kept going back and forth about putting this slide up here, but after Robert Wright's talk, I thought we might as well go here. So this is a quote from Peirce. And I'll explain how it relates to this whole talk. So it says, sporting here and there in pure arbitrariness would have started the germ of a generalizing tendency. Its other sportings would be evanescent, but this would have a growing virtue. Thus, the tendency to habit would be started. And from this, with the other principles of evolution, all the regularities of the universe would be evolved. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea, this notion of evolutionary habits that Peirce had about the universe. So according to him, the regularities of the universe, including its physical laws, is a byproduct of an evolutionary process, and can be interpreted as the habits that the universe has acquired. Doesn't necessarily have purpose, it's just the way it is, right? So the question that might be a little speculative is life a habit? Is life one of those habits of the universe? And if it is, where does it stop? And there's a recent biocosmological paper that I thought was really interesting when it comes to this topic. They've in this mathematical framework of evolvability, Stuart Kauffman's theory of adjacent, and I related to Terence Deacon's work in inverse Darwinism, is that life has this innovative part to it. And they've argued because of this innovative aspect of life, it doesn't just adapt, but it's not just fitness, it's fittedness, as Terry sometimes puts it. It can just grow and grow in a very fast way. And they've mathematically argued in there that the amount of information in life is going to soon trump the amount of information in the physicality of the universe. And that the biosphere is going to be the major source of information in the universe. They also put in there just outrageously speculative that the same time life was emerging on Earth, that's when dark energy appeared on the universe. Very close coincidence. So very speculative, but they went there. So is life an inevitable regularity of the universe? If it is it going to stop here? Will it expand to the planetary scale? And we know like a major evolutionary transitions is a model for how this process can expand across scales. So if that's the case, can we study and visualize the noosphere as a developing living organism? The same way we could see some of the dynamics of a living cell. And so the the research Michael and I have done in neuroscience, we're trying to realize the importance of geometry and shapes in the brain, and we're trying to analyze the brain as not this system that just computes bits and just it has this computational logic to it, but a organic system that works with grounded shapes, and that's the unit of information and means of communication in organisms and brains. So scaling that research of ours to the globe is that can we use geographic mapping as a way to visualize the geometry embedded in the noosphere? And as you can see on the right that's the map of the languages on Earth. So that's the kind of information that would be lost on us if we didn't look at the geometry of the noosphere, for example. And in earlier phases of this project, the same way we were reconstructing some of those geometric shapes in the brain, we use Google Trends data to kind of reconstruct these higher dimensional geometric shapes and see maybe as a content of information in the noosphere, how they look like, how much shared dynamics they have between each other, just as a way to practice getting used to some of these more geometrical approaches of studying the noosphere as an organism. One paper that's been a major source of inspiration for us is Humanistic Geography by Tuan. Yufu Tuan, should I put his name here? He emphasizes why context matters when studying geography. So it's a contextual window into the anatomy and physiology of our planetization. Can we use it that way? Some of the quotes that I liked from his paper: being aware of the differences in the human desire for coherence, and note how these differences are manifest in the organization of space and time, and in attitudes to nature. So, and to encourage cooperation rather than competition by evoking a sense of shared space and being. So it kind of has that psychological aspect to it too, the same way as the overview effect, for example. Can we kind of evoke this sense of shared space and being? Another quote that I enjoyed: the humanist's competence lies in interpreting human experience in its ambiguity, ambivalence, and complexity. His main function as a geographer is to clarify the meaning of concepts, symbols, and aspirations as they pertain to space and place. And he goes further and says, knowledge of geography is necessary to biological survival. So it might aid our evolvability through increased self-knowledge when we could look back at ourselves and see our geometry and see our sense of being and see our the dynamics on a global level. And I want to give an example of where that if we were a biofilm, how that could have aided us, right? So the context that can be used in geographic mapping. This biofilm, because there are energetic constraints, the cells in the outer parts of the biofilm, they periodically stop growing. They do intermittent fasting, so the cells in the interior part can thrive as well. If we were just looking at this and we didn't know the context, which is the metabolic constraints, we would have missed the whole point of what's going on here. Because we know, if we were to map the gradient of metabolism on this, we'd say, oh, okay, the cells don't have metabolism, they're starving, so the outer cells stop eating, So the inner cells can thrive, and it goes on like that. So, and we would say, okay, metabolic independence is deadly for the group. So that's where I think that's what Tuan meant when he says geography is necessary to biological survival. So the context matters. That's the point of this. Another recent paper that's talked about intelligence as a planetary scale is this paper by Adam Frank. Got very popular, got a lot of press. So it talks about different stages of maturity of geosphere, biosphere. It doesn't call it noosphere, it calls it technosphere, although it does mention Teilhard. But is it just intelligence? Can we just use intelligence when we're talking about it? So I think it's missing the point about having some sort of intrinsic goal-directedness. But the good point that it makes is it mentions how biosphere require diversity in order to go through its development fully. So if that's the case, do we need diversity on the noospheric level, which we could call neurodiversity? And we know that diverse, more differentiated systems are more evolvable, intelligent, and arguably have higher sense of identity. So can noospheric geography act as a way to distinguish and realize the dynamic between the core identity and the differentiated diversity within a living whole? So some of the reasons, again, why we're doing this: bottom-up science, evolutionary history, developmental trajectory; top-down theory, biocosmology, life, and noosphere might be an inevitable part of the universe. And to ground the noosphere and helps us see it in context. That's the point of humanistic geography. And of course, work of Terence Deacon, the autogen, to me, it laid out the general principles for how goal-directedness and life can originate from matter. And how molecules can become about something and create identity. And to me, it's because it's laid out the principles, we can study it on different scales. And to me, the strength or the emphasis that it has on embodied physical forms and metabolism, it's laid out the foundations for what life is. And if the noosphere is living, that's where we should look. So where is the autogen, which is the model for how life and goal-directedness originates from non-living matter? Where is that on the noosphere? And Michael Jacobs' work on bioorganism is to kind of realize all those principles in an organismic level, which calls the bioorganon, a model of interdependence between energy, information, and knowledge in living systems. And Michael has identified all these different parts of what makes an organism. And it involves metabolism, communication, production, knowledge, body, and in different scales. So seeing the noosphere as the natural extension of complexity in biological evolution, from the cell to the human body and to the noosphere. So I'll let Michael take it.
Okay, thank you, Parham. Okay, I'm actually gonna jump right to here, and then I'll go backwards for a minute. So part of what we're doing is going to be very speculative, right? When we first jumped into this project, just to give some background from
Ben Kassira was asking us, how can we understand the noosphere as an organism? Like, can you just show us, prove it? Let's build a whole model, and we can do experiments with it. And where do we even begin with this sort of level question? And the words like superorganism, global brain have been used in this conference at different times. Sometimes to refer to the same thing when they're referring to the noosphere, sometimes to refer perhaps to an aspect of the noosphere or some collective process, or maybe just to refer to something like an organism, which was actually where I kind of began the project, was just to see how the biological sciences, to see how they had converged on a definition of what an organism was. And then it became pretty clear to me that they really hadn't. I don't do as much work in basic biology, but I kind of was looking back in the literature. It's like, some people think we don't even need the word organism, that it's actually a distraction. And so that's what kind of prompted me to go back to try to build this model that Parham was mentioning. This was just a tool that I felt we needed in order to then go forward and build something or propose something very rudimentary, however it might be, to help us understand the noosphere as a biological process. And so you'll see some of the words that are on here are, pretty, we tend to not attribute, some of the criticism I received pretty early on was, well, knowledge, that's like anthropomorphic, and like not all organisms have that, and that sort of thing. But I'll explain just a little bit about that, because then I think it will help set up some of the maps that we'll show you and how we're trying to put our maps together. So the basic part of the impetus for this was, as Parham was mentioning, we've been highly influenced by Terry's work on basic understanding how life began. And one of the things that becomes clear when you read some of that origins of life literature and theoretical biology literature is that the sort of autopoietic model is a struggle. There's a real challenge with that, sort of self-making. But you can see that's the basis of sort of what I'm trying to show here, that all organisms have some sort of body, some sort of container, and some way of recapitulating that very same body. And that's what I have here by the word production, which kind of evokes more building than I intended, but I think at least we'll make it clear, self-making, self-building, right? That somehow biological systems are able to do that. But what I think is one of the key insights that comes out of Terry's work, but also others, is that organisms don't just make themselves, right? They're able to adapt, they're able to evolve. There's the whole concept of evolvability, that they can promote their own evolution to a certain extent. And so that most organisms have evolved some system in order to do this. And whether it's for single-celled organisms, it's typically their nucleus, their genetic material, the genetic networks that enables them to sustain, to draw, not only guide to production, autopoiesis, to make themselves, but also as a mechanism for innovation through mutation. And so that's what this sort of central backbone here is about, producing through knowledge to sustain that very body, but also to continue to innovate and evolve. The other sides of this are communication and metabolism. And so what I wanted was a very generic words to describe the processes that are necessary, that then guide, that are necessary for knowledge, right? That are necessary for the production process as well. So it's not just merely that we need a sort of storehouse of knowledge or of genetic material, but there needs to be some dynamic ability to shape the embodied environment, right? So to both gather information from the environment and make decisions and activate based on that, but also that's what the communication side is, sort of emphasizing the information processing dynamics of organisms. And then the metabolism side is sort of emphasizing the sort of energetic material processing side of organisms, that they need to both extract material, process and digest, and utilize that, incorporate that into their bodies, utilize the energy that
is released from the breakdown of those materials. And one of the things that's sort of interesting about that process is that I put them on two sides of the same spectrum, that all processes that require communication in biology are entangled with their metabolism, and all processes that are metabolic in some way provide really essential information for the organism in order for it to survive. So that's why, those are the components. Within cybernetics, there are lots of papers that you can see. People have really tried to break down all sorts of different facets of an organism, but our goal was to try to come up with something like as bare bones as possible, so that then we could start to apply the noosphere to that model. Okay, and so that's now you can see how that same idea gets now replicated forward in specific examples, like a unicellular or single cellular organism, a human body as an organism, and then potentially up to the noosphere. And I'll focus on that in a minute. I want to just kind of make the point about what I was talking about, like production, right? It's in a cell, it becomes very clear, protein synthesis, building blocks, we put it all together, we make a cell. When you get to the multicellular body, and that production process isn't just merely reproducing more material, it's also action, it's behavior. So it's a more generic use of that terminology. So I'm going to focus in on our model here for a noospheric organism. And so it's in the same layout that the body of the noosphere, of course, needs to be made up of us, human people. And that what I see that enables the ongoing making of the noospheric organism, not just people reproducing, but the whole sustaining of us on a collective scale, is our technology. And again, I'm using that in the most generic, broadest sense possible, right? That those aspects of our, to a certain extent, our symbolic communication is a form of technology that co-evolved with the material technology we developed, as was mentioned throughout this conference, and the shaping of tools and hammers and the like. So that's the level at which I imagine technology, but also at the scale that it was discussed, in the conference, that the built environment we have now called the technosphere. In companies, we need all of that to sustain our populations. And so what becomes, I think, part of the more speculative side to this is I don't think we're really functioning like that right now, and I'll give some explanations to why that's the case. And part of that is that what are we using to guide the sustaining, the autopoiesis, if you will, the self-making, the maintenance of the noosphere is got to be guided by our shared information and that processing. And I don't think it's nearly organized on the same level that either a brain or a nucleus is. But potentially that's where you could go, right? If the infosphere was a source of knowledge, and maybe not even knowledge, but wisdom for the whole species, that we could both be a mechanism for innovation and maintenance of our society. So that's the sort of central piece there. And then on either side, culture and economy probably would have been better if I had emphasized it as something more like metaculture or meta-economics. These are really the higher order dynamics within cultural processes that carry them, that catalyze themselves. Leanne Gabora is a cognitive scientist who studied culture and the way that it can catalyze its very own ideas, right? There's this sort of meta dynamics within culture, and that's part of the communication, right? So culture as a mechanism for communicating on a planetary scale. And by the same token, meta-economics can very much be seen by just the sheer sum total of everything that we do that's outside of our bodies that then also sustains us. Gary Lin is a writer who's written about meta-economics, where
you're not only seeing yourself with respect to economic sustenance, but you're imagining the benefit of others with respect to economic sustenance, and how do we build economies around that. So this is in some sense an aspirational model, perhaps, I don't know, where we would want what an organism would look like in a music of the spheres sort of way, as Boris would say. Okay, so I already went through that. So now I'm going to switch to the movie part of the show. We have a few little short clips that we put together that are actually animations based on our model and based on data that we've pulled out of various sources. There's maybe also as background, there's a video on the Human Energy website. It's called Mapping the Noosphere. If you haven't seen that, you can see the first version of some of these videos where, Parham, you can also probably speak to it better than I can. What Ben asked all of you to just extract as much data as you could about the growth of humanity over the past 100 years.
Yeah, it wasn't conceptual. We just found any data we could and mapped it onto Google Earth.
Right.
Yeah, so.
So our goal was to try to be a little bit more conceptual with it so that it might visualize some of this biology. So I'm going to try and make 3 points with this. Some of these are things you probably already know, but maybe you'll visualize them in a different way. And take the animations with a grain of salt, or we're not animators either. So the three things we'll show is the co-expansion of humanity and technology that is just dramatic, the great acceleration. It's also called over the past century or so. We'll show some evidence for the emergence of the infosphere out of the technosphere. And then lastly, what might potentially be seen as this entanglement between culture, economy, and infosphere, where there's a sort of higher order organization between those processes. We don't really quite see evidence for that yet, but just to give you a sense of what that could look like if we were to use this as a method. So this is that first video that I mentioned. This is obviously the planet, and what we're going to show is the growth in population given by the size of these little icons of each country. So those are called cartograms. Those are going to grow over time. These little green icons, just over here in the legend, like this was, if we start at like 1900 as being like the small population and 2020 being its maximum, you're going to see these populations grow. And then you're also going to see, and the color of the icon shows the fertility rate. So you'll see the darker the country, they're going to grow fast because they have a higher fertility rate. And then also in yellow are sort of trade routes that get filled in with pavement. And so you'll see that happen over time when they turn orange. And then there's also these trade routes. They're probably a little hard to see in yellow. Crossing the ocean, those would turn into submarine cables. Watch just this filling in of the roads, the technology, and how that coincides clearly with the growth in population across the globe that we're filling in. But also note the fertility rate really does start to drop off at the end. Really only the African nations are the ones that are maintaining high fertility rates, and that you can read all about that kind of thing in the New York Times right now if you want, what that's going to do for us as a society. So now I'm going to show this other piece, which is the emergence of the infosphere. Of course, in all fairness, we've always had an infosphere. There's always been a place of a repository of information. And in earlier versions of this, we had tried to diagram books and how often they're produced, and we're leaving that out. We're leaving that story out for now because we haven't found a great way to map that yet. But this is at least, I think, the infosphere that a lot of people are talking about with respect to the internet, of course. The largest orange circles, when they appear on here, are, the nearly 100% of the country has an access to a cell phone. And then you'll see the equivalent up in terms of internet use per capita up above in purple. So this is starting in 1995.
obviously this is where it's really dramatic, right? And what is amazing about it, I think, is the extent to which what cell phones did, right? I mean, I think that's nobody, I don't know who would have predicted that, of course, but it wasn't merely connectivity, although you can see the submarine cables now get filled in across the continents, but it's the cell phone use that really drives the access of everybody in the planet to the internet, which is a pretty remarkable phenomenon. So the last few videos here are going to show the economic scale, and starting here with the economic scale, but to get at what we think is something more like the metabolism of the noosphere and the exchange of goods, literally, that enable us to build and sustain the societies that we do. What's plotted here is actually going to be the percent change year over year in either the GDP, which is given again by the little icons in each country, and then the percent change in trade between countries. And there's not, unlike the previous slides where there's this big dramatic, increase in connectivity, what we're emphasizing is change over time. And so there's not going to be a clear pattern. And that's actually the point here, is to show something that looks a little bit more like a metabolic system. It's just a dynamic process that's being churned through. So I'm going to play it. It's going to go a lot faster than the other ones, just marching through the decades. Just the countries are getting bigger based on their population, but the trade is just still, in general, there's a trend towards increasing GDP, but there's ups and downs throughout all of that. Now, the last bit here is like the hardest one. Where do we begin with mapping culture? And I still think that the language map is still the best. But capturing that in terms of dynamics is not so clear. And what we're interested in here in particular was that sort of metaculture description that I had, which is the sort of dynamics of communication and how that gets amplified. And so here what we're going to show is the popularity of Google searches for MySpace over time. Does anybody remember MySpace? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go, MySpace. I liked when Jaron Lanier was here like a few years ago, he talked about how much MySpace was so much better than Facebook. And it was a real loss for the community. I think he's probably right, although I didn't spend much time on it. So what we're going to show is up above, MySpace, Google searches, and the circle will show within a country how I think it was the maximum number of searches for MySpace, or is it the total population? I think it's relative to other countries, how often they were searching for it. And then the lines show the correlation between countries. So not only were they searching for it at the same time over the course of the year. And then down below, we're also going to show the economic trade. And you can see it kind of fluctuates up above, down below. There's some fluctuation. Frankly, wouldn't have expected MySpace to have a major impact on global trade or economy. But you can sort of at least get a sense of how these things are operating. But the last piece I'll show you, which I think is trending towards something that would be a way for studying noospheric geography on at the scale that we're looking at it. Now we switched, and I'm going to put in Google searches for COVID from 2017 to about now. Obviously, in 2017, hopefully nobody was. Only a few coronavirus researchers were studying, but now I'm going to play that one. So here, just for a brief moment, as we all remember, from 2019 to 2020, there was a change. So there's 2020, you can see actually there was some economic slowing, right? Even though we were talking about nothing, we didn't have total collapse, but there was certainly an economic slowing, although some places may have increased. Here we do see a correlation, right, between what was happening, what we were all talking about, and what was happening in terms of our ability to exchange goods and services. And then once things started opening up again, you can see in 2021 that really rapid increase in the terms of the economic rebound. And so some of our work has been to try and distinguish. I mean, this is the clearly in this sense, I think these things are highly causal, but that's not really the. I mean, we all know that already. So the question is, how can we get into the nuance of some of this and look at? And Parham and I've started to do some work looking at financial trades, and the places where we do have data, right, are in the large stock markets around the globe, and we can look at more fine-grained analyses, similar to some of the work that Johan Ballen does out of Indianapolis, which is to look at sentiment analysis, for example, of Twitter, and see how that affects the market. But here there's an opportunity, I think, for looking across the globe at those sorts of phenomena. Okay. What does this tell us? I mean, this mapping endeavor was kind of fun, I guess, maybe, I don't know. But do we learn something from it? And I think thinking back to the original project, or the original conceptualization we had that we called the bioorganon, what this enabled us to see or potentially not see. One is, I think you can very clearly see the technology for evolutionary transitions, right? That in order to build up the infosphere and internet, we first had to have this dramatic infrastructure in terms of our roads and the cables, and particularly cell phones. So the way we're trying to imagine technology in a much broader sense, that single-celled organisms had to build a certain technology that was outside of themselves, in a sense, in order to connect with other cells. Their membranes had to recognize other membranes. They had to build skin to encase them all. Is that inside? Is that outside? And I think our technology is similar. And so what is outside technology for us is sort of the innards of the noosphere. And so that's part of this evolutionary transition that I think we've talked about is underway. The second is that there's something kind of brain-like about what could be happening, at least, across communication and culture and in economy, and that we have sort of likened that to embodied cognition, that it really depends on the material substrate. We cannot build our Twitter and our infrastructure without materials, literal goods. And so, but more importantly, this idea that potentially the cultural dynamics and the economic dynamics they have their own self-organizing and various runaway processes. How do we couple them to constrain each other? And that's one of the questions that Terry's had with his work. And one of the questions, can we apply that on a planetary scale to think about constraining runaway processes and self-organizing processes? And then the last bit was about evolvability. Do we have a sort of center of knowledge, a seat of wisdom as a noosphere, and I'm not so sure of that yet. So I think that's what we're all here to try to help bring forward. The last point basically about this is, what does this tell us then about, it tells a little bit more about the noosphere. What kind of an organism could it potentially be? And so the fact that there's, as a neurobiologist, there's these sort of critical windows, they're called, for the development of the nervous system. As a young brain is being wired up, there are certain requirements that have to be met just around that point in time. If you don't miss it, you don't have it, you miss that window. And I kind of wonder about technology and cell phones being a sort of critical window for us in terms of connecting up right now. So where will we go with it? We'll see. But I think it certainly suggests, as Parham was from the beginning, that there's some sort of developmental process. The second point goes back to what I was saying about brains and information and energy, how they couple. It's interesting to note that in a developing brain, the information is actually not that well coupled to its energy. So in an early embryo, it just gets flooded with metabolic resources, but it doesn't have the same
like well organized, what's called hemodynamics, sort of blood flow regulation into the brain. The brain errs on the side of let's give it enough resources to make sure that it really can come together. And then out of that, the information and energy coupling comes out. And so that's, I think, where we are right now. We're clearly not coupled in our ability to, on some level, we're certainly coupled, right? The stock market, but it doesn't have the same planetary coherence. And so I'm wondering if this kind of points us towards sort of more like an embryologic process. And then the last point is that many of the sort of, that an organism has its own sense of self, which Terry mentioned briefly during our panel. When will the noosphere develop that? Will it come out of the internet, the infosphere, or something else? And so again, when does a child develop a sense of self? When does an embryo develop a sense of self? These are the kind of questions that I don't have answers to, but I think this sort of work raises. So there we go. Maybe Stanley Kubrick kind of had it figured out from the beginning. The noosphere is like this embryo. And Parham really helped drive this home for me when he said this was actually, maybe this image is really, really important, because what's the attitude, if anything, what we're going to leave from here, we're not going to remember any of the things we talked about, but we'll remember the feeling we had, the good conversation we had, and we want to have maybe project that sort of good feeling back towards the noosphere, to sort of love it like you would a young child. And we don't know what kind of a child it's going to be, but that's the sort of the image that I've been left with from some of this. So here's a little thank you for everyone at Human Energy. We have a team of people that have worked on a lot of this project, including Terry, Boris, Frederick Steele, Clement, and Geraldine Sarmiento, who's a graphic designer, is helping us put together some videos that I'll show. Yes, this is Terry looking at his own brain. That's your brain, right?
That is.
That's
it is.
Okay.
Not exactly.
Not exactly. Close enough, right? Right. And one of my other slides, I had like a picture of like just how smushy the brain was and bloody, but I thought that would gross people out.
Thank you.
So. Okay.
I'm sure mine's squishy.
Squishy, yes. Warm brie cheese. That's what
It is green, yes.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
green, a green plastic brain.
Questions?
First of all, thank you. It's very exciting work. I'm thinking back at your slide of the correlation between cell, brain, and noosphere.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering why you don't have cell, human body, and Earth, because that would seem to be the obvious step up there. And noosphere is normally associated with culture, information, not the economy. The economy would be part of the the physical built environment, anthroposphere, the technosphere, whatever you want to call it.
Great.
Can you tell me why you
Yeah,
do that?
that's an excellent question. So the first thing that I'll say I would actually point to is one of our colleagues, Boris, has a paper. Is the Earth doubly alive? Is the title of his paper, in which he sort of contrasts the idea of Gaia hypothesis as the Earth as alive, and the noosphere as a distinct organism somehow related to the Earth. And we've had some spin-offs. Well, maybe like there's a mother-child relationship there, right? Something kind of like that, mostly, poetically thinking. But so in that sense, you're right. You could very well have put the Earth here. And our goal was to really follow in the footsteps of the sort of question around Teilhard's question of superorganism, organism. And so is the noosphere an organism? I think you could probably do either. I don't think that, I actually would include the economy in the noosphere, actually. Like I think of that, and it goes back to the this both culture and economy. I mean, I'm not a sociological theorist, but I'll read their books, and the way that they talk about culture and economy and technology, I can get really mixed up into sort of seeing them as they do have this, there's clearly distinct processes. I don't want to downplay that, but I think that they have co-evolved in ways that if you, and that's the benefit, I think, of a noosphere concept, which is in some sense distinct and higher order from any of those alone.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I completely, I'm with you completely. The noosphere is a distinct, relatively autonomous sphere,
Right.
along with the geosphere and the biosphere.
Right.
So to me, that's pointing to the need for a more complex view of Earth, of
Yeah.
Gaia. I can't help but bring up
Yeah.
where I'm living.
No, please do.
Connection, which is with the work of Edgar Morin.
Uh-huh.
And he tries to help us think of the complex relations between the noosphere, the biosphere, the sociosphere, the psychosphere, and so on, and how they are all holographically, but also recursively and dialogically related to one another.
Right.
So it's an invitation to look into the work of Edgar Morin, who also has a robust, systematic exploration of the nature of what is life. In the second volume of Method, The Life of Life, that is, I think you'll find very strong ally resonant with many of your distinctions. About
Great.
self.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Go for it.
Yeah.
Good.
Hello, I'm Abel Fournier. So for I do have a problem with the word brain and the super brain, even more so perhaps. So superorganism, super brain, global brain. This concept of the brain itself is so grounded in the cognitive science of the last of the 20th century, last half of the 20th century, and if we want to move toward the noosphere, we don't want to be that brain-centric. And I still hear a lot of language here at this conference, which is too brain-centric. Even this morning, access consciousness, and we have we're looking in our brain. No, we're not looking into our brain for that. And then we have the image again of the brain and with the arrows going out, and all of this is too brain-centric, and we have moved away from that already. I mean, we do have alternative programs with the theories of embodiment and others. So that's one thing, and I'm wondering for you people who are really closely involved all about the energy, human energy, if there have been other concepts being looked at instead of global brain and superorganism, maybe the not one. For example, you had the concept there, self-identity, and it is, the noosphere is as the self-identity of the Earth recognizing itself, the planet recognizing itself, this self-identity. We all have a self-identity, and we have many aspects of self. So something along those lines perhaps can reflect this the pluralistic many, and still with the concept of one, but which is not this super organism or super brain or just thoughts.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Those are.
I'm looking at Terry.
Yes.
Well.
You're welcome to chime in.
I'm actually quite against the brain, even though I'm a neuroscientist.
Yes.
The brain metaphor I find troublesome.
Right.
In part because, first of all, there's many kinds of brains in the world.
Right.
Many of them are not centralized in a head.
Right.
And
Right.
that's important to
And
recognize.
no brain at all for some living.
Yes, exactly,
type.
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, but yeah, it's troublesome for the reason you mentioned.
Right.
I think it's troublesome also because we humans think brains are so important. Because that's how we define ourselves. He says
Right.
against all these other creatures, but in fact, it's only a very special case.
Right. And we do have a lot of knowledge that has moved beyond this brain-centric. So
I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, really. I mean, I'm clearly the product of my.
But it is the case that at least two of us are neuroscientists.
Right, that's exactly what I was about to say.
And the
By
brain
training,
is-
so we have a bias there.
And the brain is included, of
Right.
course.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and even if you just stay focused on the human, it is an embodied brain. And so you can get organs like the heart involved if you want to, either metaphorically or physically. I wanted to go back to this diagram because in some sense the cell is biological, the human body is biological. There needs to be another one there, which is, as the other commenter was making, the biosphere. And then I see an interesting map between biosphere and neurosphere, because you could map the changes in climate over time. And if you were to move away from gross national product or domestic product, which are metrics that perhaps some of us are concerned about or not measures of success, into mapping on the Human Happiness Index or the Human Capacities Index or capabilities, Martizan, then I think you'd have a very interesting map of the whole planet and how it's changing biologically with the mental health of the population, basically. And you already made reference to the talk yesterday. Yeah, so I think if you map the biosphere and the noosphere, then you'd have some interesting correlations because you'd be at roughly the same scale.
Yeah, and we'll need a three-dimensional world. You'll have to go sit inside just to grok all of it, right? I mean,
That's right.
but I really appreciate those suggestions, Parham.
Make it four-dimensional, do it over time.
Yeah.
So Wernadsky also was involved in the concept of noosphere. He thinks noosphere comes out of the biosphere. He doesn't see it as two different.
In fact, let me add to that, because Bernatsky particularly felt that you look at the evolution of life, brains come quite late in this process. And they are not separate from it on top of. They're actually a part of life as it differentiated. And so I think, so I mentioned briefly that we're all caught in this sort of shadow of Descartes, where we keep brains and bodies separately. That's not what was in mind with these two thinkers. They actually thought that it was an integrated whole. And so the noosphere, if you read different parts of Teilhard's work, does involve economics, does involve the energetics of the world. So it's artificially separated if we think it's that separate.
Monica.
Whoa, caught there. I think of the, when I thought a lot about how to map the noosphere as well, and even mapping is a difficulty. We have to be thinking on a meta level of what we're looking at that is developing. And I think of the noosphere as a hyper body, hyper mind, that is an extension of the human. Both our body with a tool-like matrix, all the tools that we've ever built, everything physical that is our shared culture, and the hyper mind as our bodies of law, all of human knowledge that is accumulated and becomes our birthright, that we're born into, that we can't be human without, as you said in your talk there. And so it's always centered on the human. So when we have these circles that separate it as somehow separate, then that makes it a little bit less confusing. And then the human is derivative of Earth, that the human's coming out of the Earth. So the Earth and cosmos and everything else is centered in the human. And as we, because the universe is developing in time, and here we are, we've arrived at this point, and now we're in this huge hyperbody, hypermind. And Teilhard used the term hyperphysics to describe what he was doing, because he wasn't talking about something above and beyond, but something that was extended. So for me, that's how I think about it.
It's a beautiful image. I just want to put up this image here is like not quite what you're getting, but sort of, right? In this sort of nesting of scales, right? This sort of Russian doll version that has been discussed so far, right? That there is a kind of hyper-organism, hyper-mind, and that it may be fractal in some sense that we build as we build up across those multiple scales. That's part of how I'm hearing what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Shima.
I have a question that I think falls on the comments and questions. So the first, I think maybe I make a comment. That's, I wonder whether map is the right word, because I'm thinking about Alfred Korzybski when he said the map is not the territory. And I wonder whether this is another trap that we're getting into in kind of like reductionism, but because we are moving towards such a complexity, and we want to reduce that degree of complexity and really make a sense of coherence out of it. And it somehow makes us again into a trap of basically reductionism as a new even evolution of reductionism by again adopting a map. So I wonder whether map is the right word, whether it should be changed. Noospheric territories maybe to kind of and then I think I say this because over this like 4 days I think of conference, there was this question of how can we inspire people to actually register and assign to this noospheric world. Like today, David Sloan spoke about this picture of building together. How can we, like, if I look at the map, so I can still not see myself engaged in this is the noosphere. So we're still kind of externalizing noosphere. And I think we're just not yet there in kind of really having this courage of involving ourselves and kind of like feeling the noosphere as something that we are actually giving birth to it and we are co-creating it. So this is something I feel like maybe, if I may suggest, that the map itself is just, maybe it's not doing the justice that Theor, because I think final comment is that Theor talks about in the phenomenon of the man about when the level of complexity increases, it reaches to a critical point where the noosphere begins to fold on itself, and that's where the noosphere begins to have self-reflection, not consciousness, self-reflective capacities, meaning that basically the system becomes so complex that it begins to reflect back on itself. It's like you're living in your house with kind of like a lot of AI sensors, and your washing machine speaks to you in a language of sensors. So that is kind of like a reflective threshold, but it's not consciousness. So I want to say, like, maybe map really traps us into reflection, and reflection, you don't get nothing out of reflection. You can reflect forever. I think Kevin Kelly was talking about thinkism. So we get into thinkism again. So we want to move, I feel, for this engagement of really looking at ourselves as really, you know what, this is a movement that I can devote myself in kind of evolving myself and contributing to something bigger than myself, not necessarily in a religious sense, but something bigger than myself that makes me kind of have a bigger identity, a noospheric identity.
Yeah, you're totally right.
Can I quickly comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Parham.
The way I think about it is that, like, Michael can speak to this. The way we measure our bodies is not good. We use EEG, all these sort of scans, which are really not that good. So I kind of see this mapping as a measuring device into the noosphere, so we could kind of see if we can get some sort of even projected data that is part of the bigger truth. But it's just really hard to see. The same way it's really hard to see what's going on in our own body. So more as this more ambitious philosophical description that you're putting forth, this is just so we could, like, as a measuring device, we could look into it and see if we can come up with some sort of models for how it might be working.
Yeah.
And there are different audiences too. This is explanatory, right?
That's right. Part of the way. Sorry. Did you
comment?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the map is an attempt to demonstrate that there is such a thing like an organism. Sorry, and it may not be beneficial to try to prove it is an organism, because it doesn't matter. I don't think to most people it doesn't matter to most people, and I think what Ben was trying to do is let's give it some substance as opposed to philosophy and theory. And this map was his attempt to try to show the interconnectedness of things and how it's evolved. But I think it's an interesting effort, but not to your point. How does it help us?
Well, but just to say though, I mean, one thing I think is important to point out about the organism piece here is that actually, and I could have been very misleading in the way that this is set up, because I set up, right, asking it as a question, but more to look for organism-like properties, right? And I think that in order to do that, you have to do what Parham's describing. We have to do, I mean, we're scientists, so we're going to do that. We may also come with other perspectives too, but we want to make measurements. I don't know a field that is looking at human planetary processes as a biological process in and of themselves. So that's a very different scale that I don't think operates anywhere else within geography. I'm not a geographer, like I said. So that's part of what we're looking for. And actually the aim, to your point, Jim, is actually to get to more of an artistic vision. That this, and that's not my job, right? So and I hadn't planned to show this, but this is like one of these very early videos that Geraldine put together for us in terms of like, she works for Apple Maps. So what are the basic elements that we're going to want to build if we're going to make a map that was a little more exciting, a little bit more dynamic, that started to carry something about like these emergent properties that we don't even totally understand that connect us. So, these are like, this is just more like as she calls it, this was a mood board, if you will, of like where we start to go when we're going to, because, Apple Maps is pretty useful, and Gray's Anatomy is really useful if you need to know the anatomy and physiology of something. So that's our background. And so I definitely don't want to give the impression that we are, that this is a work in progress, 100%, right? So thank you very much.